This first video for Lesson 10 focuses on digital publishing. First, I want to talk a little bit about the contemporary context for publishing, and then I want to share a couple of stories and pose a bunch of questions and issues for us to consider. The focus of this video isn't explicitly on book design, even though this is for our document design and media presentation class. Rather, here we'll be thinking about the production, presentation, and distribution of a particular document or piece of media, the book. So let's first talk context, and let's first talk big context. There have been some pretty huge shifts that have occurred with digital tools and technologies. A mentor of mine, Jim Porter, once claimed that it's not the computer that's really the big deal. Rather, it's the networking that can happen, the ways in which we can transform texts, messages, and relationships across computers using spaces like the internet and the web. With that in mind, a huge shift has to do with what Larry Lessig calls read-only culture. Larry Lessig is a law professor and a lawyer who works at Stanford. And a read-only culture is a culture where readers are situated as always already and only readers or consumers of text. But we well know that with today's network tools and technologies, we live in a read-write culture where readers can adopt the characters of a novel and write new pieces of fiction. And we could argue that readers have been doing that for a long time. But today those writers can post their creations on sites like fanfiction.net and share it with thousands of other reader-writers. If you haven't visited fanfiction, writers take pieces, bits, parts, characters, plots, and themes from anime, books, movies, and more, and extend the storylines, extend the plots, revise the way the characters live their lives. So, for instance, on the site, more than 679,000 stories have been written that take the original Harry Potter character settings and themes and revise and rewrite them for thousands of other reader-writers to enjoy. That's new and that's significant. Other big context differences have to do with the ways in which the industry works. Self-publishing and print-on-demand technologies have transformed traditional publishing dynamics. Tools like Amazon Kindle invite authors to publish bits and pieces and stories quicker than ever before. And the distinction between the big name authors and writers starts to erode when you can use the Kindle store to buy, for instance, Stephen King's latest story, or a story an author submitted for publication through Kindle, bypassing the major publishing companies. The work of literary agents and others involved in publishing have changed. Sure, the old school process of submitting a letter of inquiry or a manuscript for the slush file still exists, but more and more agents and acquisition editors have to be much more proactive. They have to live out of Facebook and on blogs and on WordPress looking for talented writers, and writers creating a buzz with what they're writing and posting to their blogs and their Instagrams and their Twitter feeds and more. Book buying culture is also transformed. I hadn't really processed how much so until I found myself recently in a bookstore and I realized I'd kind of forgotten how to shop in a bookstore. I usually spend so much time on Amazon toggling to recommended books, looking at other reader-writers' top read lists, that the conventional physical interface of a bookstore kind of befuddled me. And a final large-scale change in book publishing and distribution has to do with both anticipation of releases and with crowdsourced reviews and ratings. The second Harry Potter book appeared on the New York Times bestsellers list before it was even released because of Amazon.com pre-orders. This was fairly shocking then, but fairly conventional now. Connected to a book's fervor in the online life is the culture of Amazon.com reviews. We've generally been able to access the New York Times bestsellers list, and maybe our local newspapers and magazines might include book blurbs or book reviews, but ours is now a culture of shared review, crowdsourced reviews, where anyone can post and share a book review. Clearly, there's a lot more we could talk about. And I hope you guys will choose to raise some other issues related to contemporary book publishing and distribution dynamics in this week's forums. I want to leave this large-scale context behind, though, and talk a bit about my experiences with digital publishing. The first experience I want to share doesn't have to do with book publishing, but rather with being an associate editor for an academic journal back in the 1990s. And this flowchart provides an overall sense of how the journal worked. An author would produce a manuscript that might take a month, 3 months, 3 years, who knows, depends on the author. But the author would then submit the manuscript to our editorial offices for the journal, which were at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. The UIUC offices would document the manuscript and forward it along to the editorial offices at Michigan Tech, who did the initial data entry and processing. We do that work, send it back to the UIUC offices, who would send it out for review. Most academic journals go through a process of peer or blind review, where the author's name and contextual information is removed from a manuscript to prevent bias. The manuscript is sent along to 2, 3, or 4 external reviewers. They don't know each other. Again, identifying information is not shared for the authors, for the reviewers. If the manuscript is rejected, the UIUC staff would write a polite decline email to authors. If the manuscript was accepted, though, the UIUC staff would coordinate changes and revisions with the author, so bounce back and forth revisions, and then eventually send the manuscript to the Michigan Tech staff. We do the copy editing and formatting and send it along to the office of the press that produced the journal, which was in the UK. They'd process the manuscript and send it to their typesetters, which were primarily in India, to create page proofs. The page proofs would be delivered back to the UK. We'd get a copy at Michigan Tech, and the authors would also get a copy of their own work. Reviewing proofs is then the final stage in the pre-publication process. No one makes major changes at this stage, but it's a chance for authors to see their work, this last chance to see it before it goes to print, and it's our last chance as journal editors to make sure that no errors have been introduced during the copy editing and typesetting stage. And this final proof stage process happens quick. Authors might get 72 hours to respond to proofs. So any changes made by the journal staff or the authors goes back to the press, back out to the typesetters, then the final pieces move into final production, is published, and then the file moves along for database processing and online archiving. Phew! As for time to publication, from when the manuscript is submitted to the journal to the moment where it appears in print, that can really vary. It depends on how much revision a manuscript needs, or how fast or how slow reviewers are. But it's a long cycle. It can take as much as 2 years. We worked that process in the mid-1990s. Now, however, the journal, along with most major academic journals, uses proprietary manuscript tracking software. It allows us to coordinate all the steps digitally. No separate emails, no faxes, no need to return copy-edited proof sheets by UPS in the nick of time. Okay, so let's turn back to books for the second example I want to share. I've published so far 2 entirely online books. One, published in 2009, is an edited academic collection called Technological Ecologies and Sustainability. It was published by the Computers and Composition Digital Press, an imprint of Utah State University Press. Our book was the first book that the digital press published, and we faced a ton of initial considerations. For instance, the press referred to projects as digitally native or digitally born. We wrestled with what that meant. Isn't all writing digitally native these days? I mean, other than maybe our grocery list, what do we really hand write? What writing happens away from a computer or tablet? We faced all sorts of considerations related to file types and formats. We wanted the book to be as accessible to as many people as possible, using as many different devices as possible. But the book was multimodal. It included graphics and video clips, and we had to address questions of how should we format the video? .mov files, .wmv files, flash files? Should we host them elsewhere? A file storage site like YouTube or Vimeo, not owned or affiliated with the press? We also had huge questions related to who owned what media. With traditionally text-only or primarily text print publications, an author usually retains the copyright to the material, although she might sign away the distribution rights to the press or the publisher. So what about digital materials that can easily be copied and shared and spread? And here's another view of the complexity of online publishing. This is a spreadsheet I produced with the metadata for a chapter I wrote for another digital book. For each individual file that made up the chapter, I had to list who the author or designer was. I had to list every file name for every component of the chapter, along with file size and file type. For accessibility issues, I had to craft 25-word descriptions for each individual web page, along with alt tag descriptions for all of the images. And I had to create a list of keywords for all the media pieces. And this was generated after I did all the work of creating the chapter itself, doing the research, doing the drafting, doing the revising, doing the writing. Being a writer used to mean writing words on a screen or a page. But being a writer today, I would argue, means a lot more than that. Today, being an author or a writer means not just being a writer or copy editor. It means being a writer, an editor, a copy editor, a researcher, a theorist, a digital rhetorician, an interface designer, a graphic designer, user interface designer, user experience designer, usability specialist, web developer, coder, programmer, code analyst, and archivist. Writing a book is a lot more complicated than it used to be, which leads us to some issues and questions related to publishing in a digital era. So clearly the roles of authors have changed, along with the tools and the media that we use. And the spaces of composing have transformed. A while ago I asked a couple of students to create screen captures while they were working. Here are 2 captures students sent me. This student included the note, I wasn't working on anything. This is generally how it goes for me. Word, Photoshop, Firefox for reference and searching, and I have some recreational stuff open. The second writer sent this capture with a note, I got your email while I was alternating between editing a video, editing a feature-length article about a research project. I just finished a short piece about the International Physics Olympiad in Iran. As for writing processes, most of us have learned a model of the writing process that includes invention, drafting, revising, and editing. To apply this relatively tidy, romanticized notion of writing to the materials these writers were producing, we might assume that they do research, gather media, draft, record, sequence, edit, and produce their work in whatever format it might take. But I would argue that a more realistic view of the digital writing process looks more like this: a wonderfully messy, recursive process of drafting and editing and researching and drafting and tweaking and researching and adding and deleting and remixing and more. So we talked a bit about delivery and distribution when considering the larger context of books in today's digital world. These lists, I think, help us think further of the differences between print and digital dynamics. Traditionally, we might have a romantic notion of the author. He sits at his desk with paper or typewriter alone, with perhaps a candle burning and a glass of brandy at his side. The work he produces is his. His name appears on the cover as the original and solitary author. His ownership is secured by copyright, and his work is transmitted in a read-only one-way transmission, book to reader, for instance. But then we might consider today's digital context, where we see more distributed, shared views of authorship. The example here is a short story called, ready for this? 50 Shades of Hay, written and posted to a Brony fan site. For those of you unaware of this culture, bronies are guys who dig My Little Ponies, and this story is a play, of course, on 50 Shades of Grey. The work and agency is attributed in diverse, diffuse ways. There might be an author associated. There might instead just be an avatar or a screen name. The writer might credit or cite E.L. James, the author of the 50 Shades of Grey books, or he or she might not. Ownership is often anchored to fair use and Creative Commons and connected to the ways in which a particular reading-writing community understands attribution and authorship and ownership. And distribution isn't one way typically. Rather, it's multi-point and nonlinear. It happens across links and through blogs and Facebook updates and other digital writing moments and spaces. Okay. We've covered a lot of ground here, and I want to end with even more questions related to the dynamics of book creation and distribution today. First, how might today's context change what we think of as an author? What does it mean when a computer can arguably be a printing press, and many people have access to one? Is there still such a thing as a capital A author? Is there still, and can there still be a literary canon? Although we didn't explore this extensively, I wonder about the value and worth of writers' work in digital spaces. Writers can no longer live and thrive on their books alone. They have to be a mini publishing empire with a strong online presence. We'll talk about that next when we talk about marketing and book publicity. I wonder how the roles of everyone who works in the publishing industry are transforming, given changing models of publishing and distribution, including the roles of librarians and architects and archivists, not to mention writing teachers. I don't have definitive answers to any of these questions, and I think definitive answers might be impossible. But right now, I can say, and I hope you guys agree, we're living in a fascinating time and moment when much of what we know about books and about reading is transforming.